Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. To old companions in terror and darkness, I greet you again as old friends. To those who are hearing my voice for the first time, I must impart a warning, directed to those of a delicate or sensitive nature. Tonight's broadcast will not be a kind one. What you are about to hear are tales woven from the most nightmarish of thought, tales both thrilling and evil. Should your morbid curiosity get the better of you, I welcome you to stay with us and remove yourself from the world you believe. But know that you have been warned. My name is August Reach, and we will now begin. Good evening. We are coming close to the end of my tales. Once completed, I will not have to do it again for some time, thankfully. I have been informed by a colleague, Lazer, that my broadcasts have already enacted a heavy toll. Pray you have at least heeded my advice regarding the occult practices and entities I have shared with you over these past few months, and always remember to keep fire nearby when listening. What do you know about werewolves? Perhaps due to popular culture you believe yourself an expert. The media has popularized the supposed mechanizations of lycanthropy, the weaknesses of silver, how a full moon will incite the transformation to one inflicted. Sometimes depicted as a curse, sometimes a gift, be it supernatural or maybe a disease in origin. I can tell you for fact it is a real condition, and paranormal in nature, exceedingly spiritual, in fact. Yet the true origins of the curse have never been explained in fiction. Our first story is titled Creakwest Hospital. The flickering light from the hallway set a sharp pain in my eyes as I awoke, so I turned onto my side and tried to get back to sleep. The drugs were causing a drowsiness I was unaccustomed to, and the unfamiliar medical setting was not easing me into any meaningful rest. I took a glance at the bedside clock. I had awoken briefly 5 times in the past 3 hours, with the time now being 4:27 a.m. I threw myself over, returning onto my back to gaze ahead of me into the hallway. Why was the hall light even on? Lights were supposed to be out after 10 and not back on until 6:30. I rose from my bed slowly, tentatively placing my still broken foot onto the floor in its cast. Fortunately, the cast gave it enough rigidity to not immediately make me cry out in pain. It had happened on Thursday evening. I was returning home after a long day at the mill and wanted nothing more than to relax with my family. It had gotten quite dark quite quickly as the nights were drawing in, so I took a shortcut through the communal park to save some time, even against my own best instincts. As I neared the middle of the park, I saw a man emerge from a tree ahead of me with some sort of tool, and I felt immediate hostile intent. I turned around to go back, but another man blocked my way. "Evening, sir," was all he said before what I believed to be a shovel came crashing into the side of my face. I'm embarrassed to say that was a finishing blow for my will to fight, and I crumpled to the floor in a pathetic heap. The other man came up with his accomplice, and both began beating me senseless. I lost consciousness after my ribs began to fracture, but when I awoke at the hospital after being found by a good Samaritan, I was informed by my doctor that I had 3 major fractures, one being a near-complete deconstruction of my foot. I don't know why they did it. I had nothing to tell the police other than my vague descriptions of the attackers. Supposedly there had been many similar attacks as of late, but no thefts had occurred or murders committed, just about a half-dozen cases of grievous bodily assault. The police had little to go on as they attacked after dark and only trapped targets. 3 women and another man are currently being treated in a hospital with me. I made my way into the corridor and a silence seemed to envelop me, the light flickering being the only bearable audible noise I could hear. I moved down the corridor as slowly as possible, partly due to stealth and partly due to the injuries I had sustained not 3 days ago. I grew fearful. Something was amiss. It was just my imagination, surely, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. I hobbled over to the nurse's station that was around the corner from the main corridor, trying to move gracefully. There was always at least 2 nurses on the night shift looking over the patients, but tonight no one was behind the desk. The desk was a mess of papers and other office equipment, with a mug of coffee spilled all over the front and onto the floor. It looked to me either a deliberate form of vandalism, or a great struggle had taken place here. I hobbled behind the desk and searched for any note or clue as to where the nurses had gone, but for all intents and purposes, they had simply vanished. I was now deeply concerned. I was in no state to defend myself from anything, barely able to even care for myself. If the nurses had abandoned us, or worse, been hurt or taken, then myself and all the other patients here were at the mercy of whoever did this. I continued searching for a good 5 minutes, making sure I hadn't missed some obvious sign that might be back in 5 or ring the bell for assistance, but I found absolutely nothing. As I began to hobble back down the other corridor, I suddenly heard something fall to the floor in a patient's room. Out of cowardly instinct, I darted behind the desk with just enough of my head above it to look at the corner the noise came from, hopefully without being seen. There was no follow-up sound of any kind, no voices or footsteps, not even breathing. I realized I was holding my breath, and stood up. "For God's sake, man, this is absurd. Just go and find somebody," I whispered to myself. Dragging my injured leg behind me, I moved down the corridor towards the source of the noise, finally having my paranoid fears find purchase in reality. A long trail of blood was coming from one of the patients' rooms down the hall, leading out into the end of the corridor past a set of double doors. I began to shake. It all began to fit. The nurses had likely been attacked, and I just hoped the patient in that room was still alive. I hobbled forward and nervously poked my head around the corner to inspect the room. Bed sheets were covered in blood, with a figure laying perfectly still underneath them. I moved into the room, trying not to knock anything or make a noise, as I knew now I was in grave danger. I approached the bed, and the figure had still not moved. My chest sunk and inflated noticeably as my breathing became tainted with an anxiety I had never felt before. I pulled the sheet down the body slowly, revealing him to be dead. I felt my breath vacate my body before realizing the sheet was caved in on his chest, too low to be normal. I pulled further down, my eyes bursting wide in horror. The man's chest cavity had been opened up, and several organs were missing. It was not an uncoordinated task. The other organs were largely untouched by my estimates, meaning that whatever took his organs did so deliberately and carefully. The double doors both burst open down the corridor, and panic set in. Where was I to go? I needed to hide, quickly and quietly. I moved to a corner where a stool was, and pulled round a divider curtain, sitting on the stool so my feet would not give me away. I was in no state to defend myself. If I was found, I would be killed. I hid just in time to hear the footsteps come past the door, and 2 voices could be heard. "For fuck's sake, Tommy, how many times? If you have to rough 'em up, do it in the head. A fucking kidney is no good if you've just beaten the shit out of it." Yeah, I know. Look, we've only got 2 hours until shift change. We should get the fuck out of here. Let's check on that lad down the corridor first. He'll be the last one. I heard them walk away from me and head back to my room, where their voices erupted again. "Oh, fuck! Fuck! This is bad, Rick. Real fucking bad." "Yeah, no fucking shit. Find him, now. He can't have gone far with that leg." At this moment, I realized if they came in here and saw the sheet pulled back, they'd search the room. I heard one of them coming down the corridor at speed. I had no choice. I hobbled off the stool, moved to the bed, grabbed the sheet, and threw it over him again. The poor bastard. I then hobbled back to the stool and pulled the curtain closed again, making sure no small movements in its fluttering gave me away. I got it to stop just as I heard the man's footstep outside my door. I breathed as quietly as I could, certain not to move an inch lest I made even the slightest noise. I heard 2 small footsteps enter the room. My heart was pumping from my chest. Was this how I died? At the hands of some madmen in a hospital? Tears streamed from my eyes without my realizing. A footstep moved closer towards me. God, was he going to check behind the curtain? I now held my breath, terror threatening to stop my heart cold. Just as I was sure the curtain would part, I heard the other's voice. "He's not down there, is he, you twat? We just came from there. Come on, he must have headed towards the front end." Again, I heard footsteps as he ran from the room and joined his friend, before their noises trailed away into nothingness. I gulped in lungfuls of air and began to breathlessly cry. What fucking nightmare was this? I got off the stool and moved through the double doors they had come from. The last place they would expect to check was where they had just been. Perhaps I could find a phone of some sort. Jesus Christ, what was happening? I hobbled through the double doors and started moving through several dimly lit corridors. Fortunately, I couldn't feel any pain in the cast no matter how fast I tried to move, but my speed was more a pathetic walk that exerted me greatly. If they came back now, I was doomed. I pushed forward and remembered this area led to another ward's nursing station. I prayed they hadn't been down that far. I hobbled past the corner and froze. 5 nurses, all laying down on the floor with their chest cavities opened up and multiple organs removed. It was the most horrific thing I had ever seen. These poor people had been cut down in their prime. Several crates were nearby. The organs had been placed inside, surrounded by ice bags and labeled. Who were these men? Why were they stealing organs from patients and nurses? I moved around the bodies to see if I could find a phone, but the only one there had the cord cut. These bastards weren't just evil, they were calculated. Perhaps they'd done this before. I moved through each of the patients' rooms in this ward as well. Each room was either empty or contained a hollowed-out patient's body, just like the one in my ward did. This was insanity. The body count was coming close to 12 now. Was it for the organs? Why? What reason could possibly justify such horror? Just as I was about to leave and find another phone, I heard movement from another room. I had already checked it, but the bed was empty. I went back inside, hoping it was another survivor like myself. As I entered, the shuffling noise came from under the bed. I knelt down slowly until I made eye contact with a woman who was even more terrified than me. Please don't kill me, please. Oh God, please. Shh, shh, I motioned. They might come back. Stay quiet. I'm a patient like you. Did you see them as well? She nodded at me before climbing from under the bed. We have to get out of here. They could come back any second, she whispered. I know. We need to call for help. Is there an exit nearby anywhere? Only the windows. I didn't want to break them in case they heard. Good thinking. I would have likely broken a window and been caught soon after had I not thought of that. Okay. If I remember correctly, there's an exit down that corridor a bit. They're currently looking for me on the other ward. We might be able to... My words were cut short by another set of doors being flung open. Hide! Hide! I whispered, and she climbed back under the bed, trying not to shake as she did. I poked my head out of the corridor and they were both there, looking around. He's not down here, Tommy. We've been here all night. Well, he ain't in the other ward, Rick, and we just searched it. We have to move... I darted back behind the corner, but our eyes had already made contact. There you are. I know where to run. You come out and we'll make it quick. You give us trouble, and we'll kick you to fucking death. I looked down at the poor woman under the bed. I was done for, I could see that now. But maybe she could still escape. I whispered to her. Once it's safe, run. Don't look back. She nodded at me, then hid properly so they wouldn't find her again. I stepped out into the corridor. Good lad, no need to give us any trouble, the shorter one spoke. They looked so calm, so relieved to have found me. They were about to kill me, and their eyes told me they couldn't care less. Why? I sputtered out pathetically. Why have you done this? To these people? The short one smiled. Money, mate. You know how much your healthy liver is worth to the right buyer. This time tomorrow we'll likely be sitting on a cool meal each thanks to Dr. Blake. Not bad for a night's work. This took us 2 weeks to organise, hardly a night's work. Well, it all paid off in the end, didn't it? After we put him in, we've got at least 4 more bodies than we would have done. My mind flared. I remembered his face. His voice. They were the ones who attacked me in the park. You planned all of this. Oh, Jesus Christ. Stop crying, you fucking baby. Sit down and we'll kill you with morphine so you won't even feel it. Or we could kick the shit out of you. This time until you're done in. Your choice. Remembering the woman under the bed had me trying my hardest to maintain my dignity. My mind went blank in defense. I suppose this is how I die. I sat down on a chair in between them, staring vacantly ahead. I knew fighting was completely useless, so I didn't bother to. One of them pulled up the sleeve of my top to reveal my veins, as the other fumbled with some medical equipment for the morphine. See? It's much easier this way. At least you can die nice and pleasantly, with dignity. Not like those stupid whores over there. We had to beat the shit out of them. I didn't enjoy it, but they left us no choice. Ruined a few of the organs as well, you know. His voice was like white noise in my mind as I phased out of reality several times. Fresh tears filled my eyes, but I refused to descend into wailing in front of these demons. My attention was grabbed again as I noticed the woman peeking out of the door to her room, and then looking past the corridor down the hall, where I told her the exit was. I shook my head slowly from side to side whilst maintaining eye contact with her, silently begging her not to try it. Just as the other man had returned with the morphine dose, she bolted. Both men looked up, surprised there was another patient still alive in the ward. "But don't just fucking stand there, Tommy! Go get her!" Tommy also darted away, giving chase, but was surprisingly not much faster. I only had to deal with one of the men now. "Did you know she was—" the short one said before I interrupted him with a clear punch to the nose, which put him on his back out cold. I expected more of a fight, but counted my blessings as I got up and started to hobble in the direction of the woman. Together we might get out of this mess. I only had to hobble a short distance before I heard her cries and pleas for help after she was no doubt tackled to the ground a ways ahead. As I tried to move quickly on my virtually useless leg, I heard her screams slowly die down, and I grew fearful he was killing her. I turned a corner to see her being choked with him on top of her, clearly in some sort of mad rage. I slowly grabbed a fire extinguisher, and once within range I moved with speed. He heard and turned his head, just in time for the fire extinguisher to collide with it, producing a loud cracking sound as I had no doubt shattered a part of his skull. I looked down at the woman who had been beaten horribly, blood spurting from several cuts on her face. She was breathing, but unconscious, so I grabbed a wheelchair, placed her in it, then hurried as quickly as I could away from the scene of the violence. The back exit was only 5 minutes away now, and I had still seen no one else. For God's sake, what was happening here? Had staff been bought off by these two? There truly was no time for questions. I had to keep moving. Halfway down a corridor, though, I heard movement coming from way behind me. The shorter one had likely woken up already and was coming to get us. As I wheeled the woman into a nearby storage room, she began to regain consciousness. I locked the door as she suddenly jumped from the chair, clutching the cuts on her face. "It's all right. It's me. Stay quiet. They're coming." I kept my ear pressed close to the door, trying to hear them. The world fell away as they marched down the corridor, cursing and screaming at each other. "What are we going to do?" the woman whispered. "We have to wait until they leave. They don't know we're in here. We should be safe." I turned to adjust my foot and knocked a paint can off the shelf and onto the floor. "What was that?" I heard through the door. Footsteps marched over to the door and grabbed the doorknob, failing to open the locked door. Tommy, I think they're in here! Help me break the door open!" Panic set in. Perhaps I could use a tool to defend myself. There had to be something. The woman grabbed me and pointed up to a window above the shelving. "We can get out that way. You climb first, then pull me up." I gave her a leg up over the shelving as the door was rammed into, over and over. She made her way uneasily onto the shelf and opened the window, putting her legs through it and reaching down to grab my hand. As I grabbed her, I could see the wood around the lock buckling. I stretched my leg up with all my effort, but then suddenly, I was falling. I looked up and she had let go of my hand. As I hit the ground, I knew my fate was sealed, and through tears she said, "I'm sorry," before sliding backwards, out of the window and closing it behind her. Just as I had processed what happened, the door burst open, the men entered the room, and the last thing I ever felt was a scalpel being dragged across my throat. I speak of werewolves as recently I have found evidence of one. A local young lad, supposedly been sneaking out in the dead of night and returning in the morning, filthy and without memory. I was consulted by a friend who frankly should have gone to a doctor, but I assisted anyway. The boys show telltale signs of lycanthropy, one of which is heightened emotional presence. You see, lycanthropy develops in a person when they exhibit a primal urge to escape or no longer be shackled in some way, which speaks to our inner beast from our spiritual pasts. We long for freedom, yet most of us covet safety or comfort instead. This young man was unable to act out his needs, and being a boy of great innate willpower, he began to manifest these energies through his repressed, wild nature. It was a shame what had to happen. Our next story is titled Reflections. And then the big bad wolf gobbled up the grandmother in one big bite and put on her clothes so he could trick Little Red once she came to the house. My daughters were now transfixed. They didn't even realize their mouths were slack as they waited with bated breath for the next part of the story. Little Red finally arrived at grandmother's house, and as she went inside, she thought her grandmother looked very strange indeed. "Oh, Red, I'm so glad you've come. Come closer to Granny so I can get a good look at you." "She doesn't do it, does she?" Lily shouted, but her sister Courtney shushed her from the other bed. "Oh, Grandma, what big hands you have," Little Red spoke as she went and sat on the bed. "All the better to hug you with," replied the wolf. "Oh, Grandma, what big eyes you have," said Little Red. The girls had stopped fidgeting, anxious for the reveal. "All the better to see you with, my dear." Little Red then leaned in closer to her grandmother. "Oh, Grandma, what big teeth you have." The girl shuddered at this remark. I paused for dramatic effect. "All the better to eat you with, Little Red," the wolf screamed as he lunged at Little Red. "No, she can't be eaten," Courtney cried out. I stood up from her at the end of the bed and put the book down. Just as Red was about to be devoured by the wolf, the brave Axeman of the forest burst into the house. The wolf lunged at him, but the Axeman took the axe and cut open the belly of the wolf, and Little Red's grandmother came tumbling out, safe and sound. I stood there, breathless and panting, as I'd acted out the swinging of the axe for their entertainment. The girls said nothing. "Well, that was a good ending, wasn't it?" "I thought Little Red was going to trick the wolf," Courtney said. I frowned slightly. I thought that would have gone down better. "If she was eaten, why was the grandmother okay? Wouldn't she have been in bits?" Lily shouted. "Well," I looked around nervously, "the big bad wolf swallowed her whole." "But how did she breathe?" Lily pushed. God damn these little girls. "She held her breath. She knew she would be saved." Lily smiled suddenly. "Oh, that was clever!" Lily beamed. Courtney still wasn't impressed. "Can you tell us a better story tomorrow, Dad? I like the one with the princess and the castle." Courtney broke into a smile as she made a request. "Of course I can, sweetheart. Right now. Time for bed, you two." "We're not tired, Dad." Lily had quietened down now, but still tried to look alert and active. "It's already 20 minutes past your bedtime. You need to get up for school tomorrow. Now, bed." "Can you leave the nightlight on, Dad?" "Of course, sweetheart." I moved over to the little play desk they kept with all their toys in the opposite corner, which had a small mirror inset into it. I reached down and turned on their night lamp, a neat little device which projected stars onto the ceiling in a dull yellow light. This thing was a lifesaver for bedtime scares. As I leant back up from the ground, I looked into the mirror in their desk. I knew I was tired, and I knew I wasn't smiling. So why did I see myself smiling back at me? I froze. I quickly looked back into the mirror. All I saw was my reflection, perfectly normal. That was pretty weird. I even made several faces into the mirror to check it all linked up. That must have been my imagination. "What are you doing, Daddy?" Lily whispered, nearly asleep already. Her sister had already conked out. I moved over to her and gave her a kiss goodnight on the forehead. "Just making sure there are no big bad wolves, sweetheart. Good night." "Good night, Dad," she spoke as she cuddled into her sheets. I turned off the bedside lamp and quietly closed their door. Archie was still up on his computer talking with his friends from school. I knocked several times, making sure that he wasn't doing anything private. God knows I didn't want to catch him doing that again. "Come in," I heard him say, a little too loudly. Must have had his headphones on. I went in and took his headphones down. Your sisters are going to sleep now. Keep it quiet. You've only got another half hour yourself before I want you winding down. Well, actually, research says there's no link between screen time and feeling alert. I could play this up until I go to sleep and I'd be fine. Oh, great. You show me the papers and I'll let you stay on until 10. His hands whirred, moving on the keyboard. What's your email? I'll send you the PDF. Archie. His eyes looked up at me and I couldn't help but smirk. I don't actually give a shit. I still want you off in an hour. Archie sunk into his chair and put his headphones back on as I went to leave. Just fuck off, Dad, he whispered, but I heard and turned back. Oi! I loaded my voice with venom. Archie apathetically turned to look at me. You swear at me like that again, you won't have it for a week. Now you've only got half an hour, and I'll be checking. He turned back to his game and I closed his door behind him. We really needed to do something together so he wasn't on that thing all the time. I made my way downstairs. I quickly went into the kitchen to grab a drink before heading back into the living room to join my wife. As I moved through the bottom of the stairs to get into the living room, I looked into the head-height mirror again. I froze. My mind blurred. In the mirror, I wasn't looking at myself, I was looking at the back of my own head. My reflection was completely faced away from me. I stepped forward, gazing ever deeper into the back of my skull, completely dumbfounded. What the hell was happening? As I moved closer, the reflection turned its head to the side, a sickening grin on my own face. It slowly lifted its right arm into view, showing I was holding a kitchen knife. My gaze turned away from the mirror, showing my left hand in the same position, holding the same knife. I recoiled in horror, dropping the knife onto the carpet, drink in my other hand. I looked back into the mirror and the reflection was normal again. What the fuck was happening? I felt shaken now. Something was clearly wrong. I had been stressed out at work recently, maybe that was it. I needed to relax. I quickly picked up the knife and surely enough it was missing from the knife stand in the kitchen. I put it back in the stand and moved away from it. Composing myself, I went back into the living room and sat down next to my wife, who was cuddled in her pajamas with a soap on TV. How are the girls? They get settled all right? I pushed the mirror instant out of my mind. I sat down next to her and wrapped my arms around her. Yeah, they got settled fine. They're too smart for their age. We're poking holes in Little Red Riding Hood. What kids do that? Our kids, because they're such clever little girls. I smiled at that and kissed my wife lovingly. What about Archie? He behaving? He just told me to fuck off. What? Her head spun round, ready to go upstairs. Relax, I sorted it. He's just at that age. If he tells me to fuck off, I'll rip that damn power cord out. I did take the piss, in fairness. I'd have thought the same if I was his age. Yeah, but that's the difference. Thought, not said. Better not swear at me. Relax. I sorted it. I gave her another kiss. I loved her fiery nature, but even I had to balance out some of her strictness with the kids. We sat and watched TV comfortably together for the next 20 minutes, but then suddenly I heard a noise coming from the back garden. You hear that? My wife whispered. Yeah. Stay there. I got up and parted the curtains slightly to look through the glass of the door. When I couldn't see anything, I pulled the curtains back and opened them, taking a step into the garden which caused the lights to come on. There was nothing there, probably a cat or something. I stepped back inside. Anything? She spoke. No, nothing. Probably just a cat. I locked the doors, but before I could pull the curtains closed again, I had frozen. The glass of the doors, with the darkness of the night beyond it and the light of the living room on this side, had turned it into a mirror. I saw my own hazy reflection in the glass, smile at me, and drop the keys on the floor. My wife stood up. Honey? Honey, what's wrong? The next few moments felt like a horrific nightmare, watching it all play out through the reflective surface of the glass. My reflection turned and fell upon my wife's throat with both hands before she even had time to react. I felt my own hands straining even as I stood completely still by the mirror, hearing my wife's breathing and desperate gasps for breath. She beat into my reflection's chest with all her strength, and I could feel the impacts in my own ribs as she landed blow after blow, but my reflection did not stop his assault. I cried, frozen in place, with pain shooting through my body as my wife desperately fought for her life. Eventually the blows became weaker and weaker, until finally she had slumped over. My reflection kept holding her throat and even squeezed tighter. I could feel the pressure in my own hands. Then it got off her, moved back to the patio doors and synced up with me again. I felt my control return, and I immediately turned to my wife and shook her. I took her pulse and there was nothing. I started to cry into her body. Good God, what had I just done? What had just happened? Did I kill her? What happened with the reflection? Jesus Christ, what was happening to me? I had just murdered my wife. I heard footsteps coming from upstairs and realized that my son couldn't see what had happened. It would destroy him. I needed to keep him safe. It nearly broke me to leave my love's body where it was, but I quickly stepped into the foyer to see my son coming down the stairs. "Don't come down!" I shouted. "Why? What's happening? I heard noises." Archie continued moving down the stairs. "I said don't move!" I screamed at him, a deep, guttural growl coming from anger and grief. He froze in place. I started to look around wildly, trying to make sense of it, trying to think. My gaze caught the mirror again, and my reflection was once again the back of my head. I was caught, staring, frozen in place again. I tried to fight it off with all of my might, but I couldn't move a single muscle. I tried to turn to Archie, tell him to get his sisters and run away as far as he could. I needed them to be safe. My reflection moved forward into the kitchen and plucked that same knife from the kitchen stand. Fresh tears filled my eyes as it suddenly turned and ran back into the foyer, out of view of the mirror and up the stairs. "Dad, why are you—" But his words were cut short by a horrible gasp of air, followed by gurgling noises. I could only stare into a mirror with no reflection as I felt my hand gripping around the knife and my clothes begin to grow damp with warmth. Archie had gone completely silent, and all I heard was a horrific shuffling noise in the quiet of night. Eventually the reflection came back into view, covered from head to toe in blood. It synced up with me again and I could move, looking down at my body to see all the same blood stains and scrapes all over it. I was even holding the knife. I turned my head to the right, desperate to be waking up from this nightmare at any second. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real! I looked at the stairs, and there was my boy, my loving son with tattered clothes and gallons of blood pouring from dozens of stab wounds. His eyes were still open, piercing straight into my soul. I had been possessed by some horrific demon, and I just lost my wife and son to this evil. I started to shake, hyperventilating. I looked at the mirror again, and a rage bored within me, making me punch it as hard as I could, shattering it into a million tiny pieces that fell to the floor. I only had my little girls left, and I needed to get them to safety. I needed to get them out of the house and with someone who could defend them from me. They couldn't see their brother or mother. It would scar them for life. They deserved so much better than this. I moved with determination. They might be awake already and tried to leave the room. I quickly grabbed my son's body, grief threatening to shut me down as I placed his nearly destroyed corpse back into his room and shut the door. I went into the bathroom, removed all my clothes and washed myself as best I could, getting rid of all the blood on my face and hands. I didn't have much time, so I just hoped the girls wouldn't notice the bits I'd missed. I changed into clean clothes and finally shut the living room door so the girls wouldn't see their mother. I entered their room, planning to wake them, carry them out of the house, and put them with a neighbour whilst I turned myself into the police. I was about to approach Courtney's bed when I remembered the mirror in their play desk. What if it was the mirrors? What if looking into them triggered this demon? I couldn't risk it. I had to cover it up. I found a blanket at the end of their bed and unfolded it into my arms. I drew in a deep breath and closed my eyes. Fumbling about blind, I eventually felt the edges of their desk. I felt the mirror, and then threw the blanket just fully over the top of the desk so that all of the mirror would be covered. I breathed in. I was certain I had covered it. I opened my eyes. I couldn't see anything. The blanket had covered it entirely. I gently stirred Courtney and Lily and told them we were going on a little trip. They were still groggy, so I didn't fight or question it. They just asked if Mummy and Archie were coming. I hid my tears and said they were already waiting for us. We just needed to go in the car. I picked them up, one in each arm. I counted my blessings they were still very much asleep as I passed the blood on the stairs, and finally made my way to the foyer. The mirror on the wall was gone. I was so close to saving my precious little girls. I looked down to turn the knob of the door, when my eyes caught my wide grin, staring back at me from one of the shards on the floor. Frozen. Again. I nearly tore out my own sanity, fighting it as hard as I could, but nothing would work. I couldn't even close my eyes or cover my ears. My mind almost detached entirely as I heard the horrible, ear-piercing screams come from Lily as she was smashed into the frosted glass of the door in the reflection over and over. I tried to scream my dread and horror as Courtney's crying wails came from what felt like underneath my heavy boots pressing down on her soft head into the ground. When the reflection synced up again, I didn't even look. I didn't cry. I just knew what had to be done. I moved like a zombie up the stairs and into my wife and our's bedroom. I went into the wardrobe, into the locked cabinet at the back. I opened up the cabinet and took out the shotgun, and loaded into it with what little ammo I had. I rarely ever went shooting anymore. At least I could end things with this. As I loaded up the shotgun, I heard a knock on the door. "This is the police, can you open the door?" I took the loaded gun, my jaw slack from being unable to do anything other than robotically fulfill this final task. I went and sat on the base of the stairs, just in front of the front door. I put the gun in my mouth and pulled the trigger. Detective Kurt had been assigned to investigate the crime scene after he got the call from two officers who were responding to screams coming from a neighbor's house. Once he turned up, he went straight to Kathy, the leading forensic analyst. "Kathy, what am I looking at in there?" She was silent. "Kathy?" She turned back to him. "I've never seen anything like it," she said. "Murder-suicide. Wife, son, and 2 daughters murdered. Husband blew his brains out with a shotgun." Jesus Christ. He was stunned. "Can I go in?" Kathy took a long, slow sip of coffee. "Yeah, get changed first though, we're still photographing more evidence." Kurt got changed into the jumpsuit and went inside. The bodies had already been moved, but the bloodstains around the foyer and stairs made his stomach turn. He noted all the mirror shards on the floor, figuring it was destroyed from a fight. He made his rounds through the house, checking each room carefully for anything useful. Sometimes the murderer would leave clues or a confession note, but he found nothing. He stepped inside the little girl's room and noted there was no signs of struggle or violence in here. He stopped to examine a blanket draped over a dresser and noted a few drops of blood on the edges. He stepped back out into the hallway, tapping someone on the shoulder. "Has anyone catalogued the blanket in the girl's room? Looks to be some bloodstains on it." "No, we'll send someone to do that now." After the blanket had been catalogued, Kurt wondered why the husband would have gone to the trouble of covering the toy dresser. He lifted the blanket off carefully, placing it in an evidence bag. All he saw on the dresser was a few toys and a mirror. There was probably a connection to the broken one in the foyer, but he couldn't think of anything. As he went to leave, his attention snapped back to the mirror. He could have swore he saw something move that wasn't his reflection. He looked around the room and then stared back at the mirror for a few seconds. But all he saw was his own reflection, staring straight back at him. Most people who feel trapped or repressed eventually learn to express themselves, or simply suffer in silence. This young man, unfortunately, was a rare person with great spiritual presence, and so before his human mind could understand his needs, his instincts channeled a greater power. This is irreversible. He was afflicted with a great need for freedom, and could no longer stay with his parents, yet his heart ached to love and be with them. In their minds, there was only one course of action. Our final story is titled Thirsty. Jennifer took a long time in the bath, not for any particular reason other than to avoid her husband for a period of time. Andrew had been home for 2 days and still not seen a doctor, but things were reaching a tipping point where she would force him to go. She washed herself thoroughly, content that she did not need to appease his sudden temperament or let him try to suck on her neck in a seductive fashion. Where once this might have excited her, in his current state it felt like a stranger had assailed her and made her feel extremely uncomfortable. They had travelled abroad with some friends to investigate an old monastery that lied within a remote region of South America, a little over a week ago. They were well looked after by the tour guides who Andrew had paid handsomely, though Jennifer never fully trusted they simply wouldn't abandon them. It was part of Carl's research that he was hoping would land him a senior archaeological research position, Carl being one of Andrew's old university buddies. Carl was more than just excited. Alicia, his wife, had explained that he was hoping this would be the last expedition he'd ever have to do, and so wanted some company along with them to help it go down far smoother. Jennifer and Andrew had agreed, as they felt that it had been far too long since they had last left the country. The location was supposedly hidden within a deep jungle and mountainous terrain, something Jennifer was quite nervous about at the time. She had a phobia of insects, had bad experiences with camping, and worried there might be other people living there that would endanger them. Andrew tried to console her several times, explaining that the guides had only ever been paid half and would be paid the other half on their safe return, so there was no incentive to abandon them. His logical, cynical take on the risks did little to ease Jennifer's fears. Carl and Alicia seemed unfazed. Jennifer knew they had been traveling around the world for Carl's research several times and were accustomed to all sorts of potential dangers, but this just seemed suspect. They all hiked through the jungle in a little under a week, the tour guides being instrumental in protecting and guiding them. They would light fires every night to keep wild animals at bay, and at one point a rather large spider had found its way onto Carl's back. They were all stricken with deathly fear, but one of the tour guides took a machete and cleanly cut it from his back. The instant had them checking each other's bodies for stowaways for the rest of the journey. On the evening of the 6th day they arrived at the monastery. It was more of a ruin than anything else for Jennifer, but it had a lot of lost majesty to it, something hinting at its once great visage. "My God, it's more beautiful than I could have ever imagined," exclaimed Carl. Alicia came up to him and hugged him tightly, which he returned as they stared at the monastery. Andrew approached Jennifer from behind and surprised her by wrapping his arms around her stomach. "I'm really proud of you for coming out here and doing this with me, despite being worried." Andrew kissed her lightly on the forehead, which made Jennifer grin. "I'm a really lucky guy to have you." Jennifer melted backwards into his embrace, both of them staring at the monastery ruins. They all sat and ate dinner before deciding between them that the research could start tomorrow, and they'd all get an early night. Between themselves and the guides, they set up a camp in a clearing not 50 yards from the monastery, and all fell into an easy sleep. Jennifer awoke in the morning to discover that she was alone in her tent, Andrew missing from next to her. She quickly got up and dressed and made her way over to the ruins, where Carl was doing some initial cataloguing, whilst Andrew and Alicia talked over a morning drink. Andrew stood up, grinning as he walked over to Jennifer. "Morning, sweetheart. Sorry to leave you to wake up by yourself, but Carl was eager to get started and I was already awake. Figured you'd appreciate an extra hour or two." He lightly kissed Jennifer's cheek after offering his explanation. "Don't worry about it. Thank you for letting me sleep. To be honest, I think I'm still tired, but we travelled 6 days to be here. I don't want to miss anything. Carl was waiting for us all to be here before he headed further into the ruins. He says we should all be together if we find something worth seeing." Alicia spoke as she poured another drink into a small cup and handed it to Jennifer. Jennifer took a sip and sat down next to her, and Andrew joined them both. They sat nursing their drinks for a while before Carl came over, excitement plastered all over his face. This place is incredible. The rock used to make the structures are like nothing I've ever seen. We've stumbled across something big. Watch this. Can I borrow your drink, Alicia?" Alicia handed over her drink to Carl as both Jennifer and Andrew watched intently. Carl took a piece of rock that was broken off from the surrounding smaller walls and placed it in front of them. "Okay, watch closely." Carl began pouring the water onto the stone, but it didn't seem to splash much to Jennifer's eyes. Instead, it seemed to almost disappear as it touched the rock. Carl stopped pouring, and the surface of the rock seemed to dry off in an instant, the water dripping straight through and into the dirt below. I've never seen a rock that could take a drink before, Andrew spoke. What's going on with it? I believe the rock is the most porous material I've ever seen, but with an added hydrophobic nature that sees the water draining straight through it, not a drop left on it. It's incredible. Why would they build the monastery out of this stuff? Jennifer chimed in. I honestly don't know, but that explains the severe weathering we're witnessing on the structures. Look. Carl placed the palm of his hand on the rock and pushed down as hard as he could, straining for a few moments before the entire thing crumbled under his force. If that was any regular building material, I'd have never been able to crush it so easily. Looks like you had some trouble to me. It's still rock, Andrew. This is fascinating. There must be some explicit reason why they'd go to such great efforts to make the monastery essentially invisible to water. So, any rainfall that moves through the monastery would just pass straight through and into the riverbed? Jennifer said, sipping her drink after. That's my current working theory, yes. But why is the question? Andrew suddenly stood up dramatically. We have a monastery to investigate and a mystery to solve. Now that Jenny's here, let's get to it. Right, you guys go ahead and start looking around. I need to go back to the camp and pick up the rest of my tools. Alicia, can you give me a hand? Alicia jumped to her feet and began walking back with Carl. Andrew looked down at Jennifer. Right, let's go find something cool and take the credit for it. I love it, let's go. Jennifer excitedly replied as they both made their way into the ruins. Carl's predictions were right. The rock was surprisingly brittle, to the point that Jennifer was surprised it had even stood this long. She made her way through the ruins as carefully as possible with Andrew, but somehow still managed to damage a piece of the stone here and there, which made both of them feel extremely guilty. They'd been exploring the main structure for some time, but were unable to find any entrance despite its relatively small size. Jennifer suddenly heard Andrew shouting from the back of the ruins. Jenny, you're going to want to see this. She ran through the maze of low stone walls and finally reached Andrew, who was staring at a huge mural he had unearthed from behind a wall of vines. The image seemed to depict a large group of people drinking from a fountain, followed by what looked like strange beasts attacking people. Andrew moved closer, tracing his hands over the wall. He stopped, and Jennifer saw he'd felt a groove in the rock. There's a door here. Help me push on this part of the wall. Jennifer got underneath Andrew and they both pushed on the wall together, feeling it start to give. After some heavy straining, the door made a sharp gushing sound as air rushed out through the crack, and the door swung open to reveal a dark hallway. Oh, we've hit the jackpot, sweetheart. Come on, let's have a look. Andrew excitedly walked in and Jennifer followed behind, trying not to think about the creatures or snakes that might be in the darkness. As they moved through, however, they saw a bright blue light coming from up ahead. Emboldened, they moved quicker until they found themselves in a large chamber, and in the center was a pool of beautifully clear crystal water that seemed to be the only light source. Jennifer had never seen anything like it, both of them gobsmacked by the discovery. Andrew? Jennifer? Are you down there? Carl's voice easily bellowed through the darkness of the hallway from outside. Yes, we are. We found something incredible. You have to see it, Jennifer shouted back. Incredible. Don't touch anything. I'll be right there, his shout replied. Jennifer turned around to see Andrew walking towards the pool. Andrew, what are you doing? He didn't stop walking towards it. Doesn't it look incredible, Jenny? I've never seen water that looks this pure, this radiant. I've got to taste it. Andrew, stop. It could be diseased. It might not even be water. Don't be absurd. His voice was almost a low whisper in response. Look at it. It's the purest, most drinkable water you've ever seen. Andrew moved over to it at speed now, before kneeling down and cupping some into his hands. Andrew, no! Jennifer lunged forward to try to stop him, but it was too late. He'd already begun drinking the water in his hands. The minute he'd finished, he took another large handful and sloppily tried to pour it directly into his mouth. Jennifer reached him in time to pull him away, but he went for a third, but he batted her away and kept trying to drink the water. Carl and Alicia came down the tunnel with two of the guides behind them carrying torches. What's going on? Carl immediately sensed something was wrong. I don't know. I can't stop Andrew from drinking that water, Jennifer shouted. The tour guides moved with speed and quickly grabbed Andrew and pulled him away. He kicked and screamed. No, please! I need more of the water, please! His cries echoed down the passage, whereas the tour guides took his struggling frame outside. The rest of the party followed until they emerged where the bright light burned Jennifer's eyes. The tour guides had Andrew pinned to the ground as he struggled, and one of them took a knife from his pocket and moved to stab Andrew, before Carl burst into awareness and kicked him in the chest to push him away. "What the fuck do you think you're doing?" Carl screamed. The tour guides remained silent and still, and Carl moved over to Andrew, who had calmed down, but still thrashed on the floor. Andrew? Andrew, listen to me. Andrew, it's Carl. You're safe. I'm here. Talk to me." Andrew stopped thrashing, just lied there, heavily breathing his recovery. He seemingly came back to awareness and looked around at everyone. Oh God, I don't know what came over me. I couldn't help myself. It was delicious. Jesus Christ, I've never lost control like that before." He began to cry, which moved Jennifer to come over to him, and they fell into a desperate hug, trying to console one another. Jennifer looked at the tour guides who had stepped aside. Carl was still furious with them. "You two, with me, now!" They wrapped up exploring for the day and headed back to the camp. Jennifer saw Carl coming over to sit with them, a heavy expression on his face. She was the first to break the silence. "Why did they pull a knife on my husband?" Carl met Andrew's fearful gaze. The experience had knocked some of the confidence from his cheery demeanor. "They believe the water is cursed. They say we are all in danger if we let him live." "What?" Andrew whispered. "That's absurd. Yes, I got a bit violent, but I didn't want to hurt any of you." "I know, that's what I told them," Carl reassured his friend. "I told them that if they want to get paid the rest of their money, they need to grow up and make sure we return safe. They seem to have reluctantly agreed." "Well, what if they attack him again? We can't trust them now," Alicia spoke. "I've also increased their pay on our safe return. Just make sure Andrew isn't left alone with them, and we should be fine. Looking at the monastery chamber, I think I can have my research done in 2 days. We'll keep ourselves fixated on that and try to be back home within a week. Does that sound alright to everyone?" "Jesus, I'm so sorry, everyone. I've ruined this trip." Andrew's words were laced with self-pity. No, it's not your fault at all. You just had a bad episode. As long as you don't drink that water again." Jennifer comforted him. She was just glad he was back to normal, even with a little dented pride. "What compelled you to do it? Did it truly taste that good?" Alicia asked. Carl leaned in, obviously having wanted to ask the question himself. "It was like drinking pure euphoria. I've never felt a physical sensation like it. For God's sake, don't try it yourself, though. Even if it doesn't drive you mad like I did, you'll probably be as thirsty as I am." Andrew gulped down another cup of water. This was his 5th one in only half an hour. "It's probably not water. At the very least, another chemical is mixed in with it. Alcohol is dehydrating, and this might be similar. Probably just need to pass it through your system, and then you'll be back to normal." "I hope so. I'll drink the entire forest at this rate." Jennifer leaned into him and hugged him again. The next few days went without incident. Carl's research was completed quickly, emboldened by the strange discovery of the water under the monastery, and he catalogued and took pictures almost in a mad haze. Andrew was for the most part trying to help, but still constantly thirsty, now drinking more and more water each day. The tour guides were nervous around him and didn't want to approach, but Jenny and Alicia took turns staying with him just in case. On the 3rd day of the monastery research, Carl was satisfied, and he had collected everything and told everyone they would pack up their gear and head out the next morning on the track home. They all decided to get an early night to speed up the recovery. Jennifer awoke the next morning with Andrew lovingly hugging her from behind, and she cuddled backwards into it. He seemed restful for once, and felt glad that he was probably coming back to himself. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get up and get home. I miss having a soft bed," he whispered into her ear. She turned her head and gave him a soft kiss, but she noted it left a faint taste of iron against her lips. She brushed it aside in her mind and got out of the bed, eager to join her friends with the leaving preparations. As they were packing out the last of the equipment, Alicia approached Jennifer from behind. "Jenny, we need to talk. I need to tell you something about Andrew." "What is it?" Just come over here so the others won't hear." She moved with her to the other side of the camp, and they busied themselves with packing other supplies. "Jenny, did you notice Andrew get out of the tent last night?" Jenny was genuinely taken by surprise. She was a light sleeper and didn't wake up once or notice Andrew was gone. No, Alicia, I'm pretty sure he was in bed with me the whole night. No, I had to get up to use the bathroom and I saw him come out of your tent and he started walking into the jungle. I thought he was just going to the bathroom as well, but then I heard a hissing sound, so I went to check he was okay. Jenny couldn't believe what she was hearing. And I couldn't see much in the moonlight, but it looked like he had grabbed a snake. What? There's no way. Andrew hates snakes. I thought so too, but he grabbed it and smashed it against a tree, Jenny. God, I hope I'm wrong, but I swear he started letting the blood pour into his mouth. Jenny, he was drinking his blood. Something is wrong with him. Jenny's mind flashed to the taste of iron on his lips and wanted to vomit, but suppressed it as hard as she could. This was insane. She pushed all of her worries away. Alicia, for God's sake, get a grip. Andrew was not drinking snake's blood in the middle of the night. You make him sound like an animal. Jenny, I could have sworn... It was dark, Alicia. How much could you have seen? It was probably a nightmare. I never felt Andrew leave the tent the whole night, and I would have woken up. Don't scare me with this shit, and don't let the tour guides hear. I'm worried about his safety as it is. Alicia backed down at that, seemingly doubting her own memories against Jennifer's accusations. Within the next hour, they had packed all of the equipment away and begun their long trek back to civilization through the jungle. The tour guides kept eyeing up Andrew nervously, not wanting to be near him. His skin had taken on a pale complexion, and he didn't sweat anymore, even in a hot, humid climate. As they left the camp, Carl pointed to the ground at a deceased snake. Good God, what could have possibly done that? The thing's head is caved in. It looks almost hollowed out. Andrew took an inquisitive glance at it. Maybe a big cat or something. Hard to tell. I'm just glad whatever got it never went near the camps. Curiosity aside, everyone kept walking, but Jenny's legs were weak when she saw its dehydrated corpse lying there, but again suppressed her primal fears. The trip home was uneventful. Jennifer made sure to check if Andrew left the tent on each of the 5 nights they made their way back, and never once was she awoken without Andrew being soundlessly asleep next to her. He continued to drink more than anyone else as they travelled, but it seemed to be winding down, and she hoped whatever that liquid that caused this was nearly out of his system. Thankful there was never a taste of iron on his lips when she kissed him. Once they returned to the city, they embarked on the tour guide's demanded payment, and quickly vanished, leaving the 4 of them to make the long voyage home. The voyage home was different, however. Andrew had become irritable, and his skin began to become more and more pale, and despite the heat of the continent, he seemingly stopped sweating entirely. He'd drink entire gallons of water in one sitting, but every time someone tried to confront him on the matter, he'd insist he was detoxing the liquid out of his body still, and perhaps the jungle was a more suitable weather conditions for his health. The rest reluctantly agreed, but Jennifer made him promise to go to a doctor's once they returned to England, which he reluctantly agreed to. Once home, Carl and Alicia took their leave, but not before pulling Jennifer aside quickly for a moment whilst Andrew handled the luggage. Jennifer, please, I've never seen him in such ill health. You have to get him a doctor, even if he tries to kick you away. God, I feel like this is my fault. Carl spoke in a whispered tone. It's not your fault at all, Carl, but please, do get him medical attention, Jenny. He will be waiting by the phone for you to tell us he's all right, Alicia added. Of course, can I call you if anything gets worse? Jennifer tried to hide the fear in her voice, but it didn't seem to work, almost trembling at the thought of being left alone with him. Of course you can, day or night, Carl said. Right, we need to get going. I best say goodbye. Carl moved over to Andrew and out of earshot of the 2 women. I'm scared, Alicia. Alicia took Jennifer into a comforting hug. We're a phone call away. He's going to be all right once he sees a professional. Have faith. Alicia's words calmed Jennifer down, but her apprehension felt as strong as ever. Carl and Alicia left, leaving Andrew and Jennifer to get into the train carriage home. First thing I'm doing when I get home is having several beers. God, I miss them. Andrew beamed. His dry skin had taken on such a white complexion it was like staring at a corpse. The first thing we're doing is getting you to a hospital. Have you looked in the mirror today? Hospital? Andrew's face was genuinely puzzled. Why would I go to a hospital? I feel fine. I might not look it, but I really think I'm on the mend. Those beers, though. God, I'm parched already. Andrew, you're not listening. You're getting worse, not better. Jennifer leaned forward. I'm taking you to a hospital. Today. No. Andrew's voice had venom in it as his piercing gaze met Jennifer's, wilting her conviction. He suddenly laughed it off. Honey, we've just got back from the trip. Give me a day or 2, and then I'll go get checked out. I promise you. Jennifer was too shaken to continue the conversation, so they sat in silence for the remainder of the trip. Jennifer had replayed the entire trip over and over in her head as she sat in the bath, desperately thinking of what to do next. Andrew insisted he would be doing a small project in the shed and was not to be disturbed. But he had still made no good on his promise to go to the hospital. His skin was almost becoming translucent now, something which repulsed Jennifer beyond measure. She cried into the bathtub. She didn't know what to do because she was losing her husband and didn't know why he didn't want to be fixed. She got out, dried herself, and threw on some light clothing to go outside and check the mail. As she did, she saw her neighbor Dorothy, an elderly woman who had only her cat for company after her husband passed away last spring. "Oh, Jenny, it's good to see you again. How was the trip?" she shouted. Jennifer walked over to her. "It was really good. We found the monastery Carl was looking for. A bit creepy, if you ask me." "Oh, really? Oh, you're braver than me, dear. I'd never go to such a place. How is Andrew? I haven't seen him about since you got back." That was because he was spending all the time in his shed on his project, but Jenny didn't want her knowing that. "He's just a bit ill at the moment. Caught something whilst we were over there." Dorothy's face recoiled. "Not contagious, is it?" No, nothing like that," Jennifer reassured. "He refuses to go see a doctor, though." "Ugh, typical. Harry was just like that, you know. They either have a cold and think the world is ending, or lose a leg and shake it off. No sense in men." Her words were light, but Jennifer felt them in her core. "Right, I'll leave you to it then. Oh, and if you see Chester, please do let me know. I put him out the other night, and he still hasn't come back. I'm starting to get a little worried. Have a good day, dear. Give Andrew my love." Dorothy went back inside, leaving Jennifer to go in and close the door. Jennifer had spent the rest of the day cleaning and generally getting ready for the work week ahead, but Andrew had not emerged from the shed until it had started to get dark. She could allow him to suffer himself, but she would not be neglected. At the very least, she deserved to know what he was doing there. She stared out of the back window of the house, staring at the shed. There was only one small window to look into it, but she could see only a vague red light coming from it as she cleaned. "Ah!" she cried. Blood dripped down from her forearm, not realizing she had snagged her arm on a sharp ornament on the windowsill. It was the last straw for her. She was going to find out what her husband was doing. She opened the back doors and made her way through the twilight of the back garden until she reached the door. Inside were all sorts of strange noises. It sounded like a sloshing, a slurping sound. Was Andrew in here drinking more beer so she wouldn't notice? She pushed the door open slowly, trying to make sure that it made less noise than whatever he was doing, so he wouldn't notice. The red light only dimly gave her a view of Andrew, who was facing away from her, messing with something on the desk. The slurping sound increased drastically. He was drinking something. Suddenly, the slurping stopped, and Andrew picked up what looked like lumps of meat and placed them on top of his head. No. He was placing them in his head. Jennifer was flushed with fear. She just noticed that his head was shaped differently. It resembled more of a cone, with the base facing upwards in profile, and there were no longer any hair on his head. There were just two lumps either side of his head above his ears, but in the light she could not make it out. A grinding sound started to come from his head, like something was being liquidated inside his skull. "Andrew?" she said meekly. He turned to her, the red light now fully illuminating his features. It was the single most grotesque thing she could have imagined, and more. The lumps above his ears were his eyes, which had moved to the side of his head but still faced forwards, like an insect's. The top of his head was an enormous, conical mouth, pieces of jagged skull set in place like circular saw blades, pulverizing whatever he had just placed inside. His hands had formed long, slicing claws, and the knuckles were covered in what looked like plated bone covered in viscera. His legs had even morphed to give long claw-like feet like a bird's. But the worst part was his mouth had morphed into a small, fleshy hole, and the nose had grown extended tube-like cartilage to become a nozzle with fresh blood dripping out at the end. "Andrew," Jennifer cried, frozen in fear. "What in God's name has happened to you?" "I'm so thirsty, Jennifer." The words came from the hole where his mouth once was, but it did not move or shift to create them. The sounds just flowed out of it. I have to keep drinking. Leave me alone." Jennifer noticed the head of Chester next to the pile of viscera that looked to have been chopped and pummeled by Andrew's new appendages, and watched as the nozzle coming from his mouth stretched and morphed around the cat's remains, sucking the blood from the flesh and bone. Andrew pummeled a piece of ribcage and flesh, before grabbing it at a clump and dumping it into his head, where his own skulled fragments rotated and whirled, reducing it into a paste he could drink. Jennifer felt wave after wave of terror flood her brain, threatening to break it in half as Andrew finally took the head of the cat and put it into his own, blending it until the mulch had gone down his throat. Andrew then turned to Jennifer. "I'm still so thirsty, Jennifer." He looked at Jennifer's arms and saw the blood dripping from it. His pupils dilated in response. Yes, that's what I need. I need to drink you. Please, Jennifer. I love you. Let me drink you." The nozzle cracked and popped as the cartilage broke and reformed constantly to extend towards her arm. Jennifer regained her courage through sheer mortal fear, turning out of the shed and slamming it closed, throwing the lock on just as Andrew's reinforced knuckles crashed into it. Jennifer, I need to drink you!" He began to let out a deep, otherworldly screech, slamming into the door repeatedly. Jennifer felt her instincts kick in, and she began to run. She got into the house just as she heard the shed door smash off its hinges, and running straight through the house into the open street. She turned back to look as she hit the street, seeing Andrew's horrifying form bound toward her at speed. She sprinted with all of her might, screaming into the night air for someone to come and save her, but no one answered her calls or even heard them. Andrew, however, was right behind her, gaining on her, then falling over due to his new grotesque physique being unwieldy, then bounding straight back up and catching up again. "Jennifer, stop! I'm so thirsty, Jennifer! I need to drink!" He finally caught up to her and grabbed her by the ankle, plunging them both into the hard concrete. "No! Get off me! No, please!" Jennifer's screams were lost into the night air as Andrew scrambled madly up her body to reach the cut on her arm, the cartilage nozzle cracking and reforming to snake around her flailing arms. Just as it was about to latch on and begin drinking, Jennifer grabbed a tree branch and smashed it into Andrew's arm as hard as she could, causing him to wail in a ghoulish howl, releasing his grip and letting her scramble to her feet. Andrew was about to get up when he saw his own blood dripping from his mutated arm. He stared at it, then back to Jennifer, and then back to it. "So thirsty," he whimpered as the nozzle latched onto the cut in his own arm and he began to drink. Jennifer watched as Andrew slurped his own blood from his veins, causing his body to hollow and dehydrate. Jennifer cried out to him, remembering the man she used to love. Andrew, please stop this. We can get you help. Please, Andrew, I love you." Andrew did not hear her pleas. He continued to drink every drop of his own blood, even as his skin turned pure white and began to flake away, until finally he froze completely solid as his body crumbled into dust before her. Jennifer fell to her knees, and through her tears screamed in agony over losing her husband. I performed a ritual with the use of a silver catalyst that allowed me to extract his beastly nature and store it into a talisman. I'm holding it right now. A rare gemstone. The family all adamantly agreed they wanted the ritual performed, including the young lad. But it came with a price. He is no longer whole, and will never feel his primal instincts boil within him. Passion, determination, euphoria, all things we treasure, will now be duller to him. Perhaps he may want this back one day. Perhaps he could even learn to control the curse. But it was not his fault, and he did not deserve such an extreme measure. I will keep this talisman safe. Perhaps one day he will regret parting with it. The broadcast has now ended. You may extinguish your fires. Good night.